Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Kristen Smith. Here with me today is Christina Langell, our Pennsylvania reporter. Hey, Christina, how you doing?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Good. So you recently wrote about cyber charter tuition. It looks like the state's going to try to save money by cutting it. Is that right?
Yeah. It's an interesting new development because it's something that Democrats have been pushing for. And then recently, the Auditor General released a report about 5 of the state's charter schools that was pretty critical of their funding and how much they are keeping in reserves. So I think that coming from that Republican Auditor General, it kind of opened the door for there to be a bit of a more bipartisan effort into maybe reforming the way that they handle charter tuitions.
Yeah, they've definitely been talking about this for years. And I too was surprised when Senator Pittman, who is the majority leader, came out and said, "Oh, we can do more about this. We can maybe figure out a better way to fund them." And I mean, because they have like a really large range of what we pay, and it's not tuition like college tuition. It's a little different, isn't it?
Yeah. So the tuition for a charter school depends on how much per student your district spends for your home district on each person. So if you live in a district where they're spending, $20,000 per student, that's how much a charter school is getting when one of those students moves into a charter. But on the other hand, if you live in a district that's only spending $7,000 or $8,000 per student, that's how much the charter is getting. So there's actually a range that goes up to, I think, like over $60,000 for some students. And, logically speaking, if they are successful at a tuition of $7,000 or $8,000, then that should work across the board because it's a cyber school. So they're all getting the same schooling, and they're not using any of the physical resources that a brick and mortar school would have. So yeah, it does seem like a lower flat tuition rate would make sense since they're not getting the variation in education that you get based on those different student tuition rates at different districts.
So
they're paying tuition at districts, but how much the district spends itself on this.
Right. So your tax money that you send to the school district, it theoretically would follow that student to the charter school if that's where they decided to go. I think is kind of the best way to think about it. And, minus some money. But I mean, you said up to 60,000 for some. What are the charter schools like? What are they justifying that spend number on? Like, why would they do that?
Well, that's just how much that district is spending on a student.
Okay.
So if it's like, I think those especially high numbers when you get up into that 60,000 range are more often happening with special needs students who have extra accommodations they need. And there is a different rate for them. Like the governor suggested an $8,000 flat rate for tuition, but that was just for like general education students, not for special needs students going into charter schools. So the problem that they've had like with basic education funding is that we have all these different schools with different property tax rates, and the schools who can spend more per student have higher performing students and are the higher performing districts. And then the schools where there are more low income people paying less property tax tend to really not do as well. They don't have the resources that they need. So that's why they've created the new basic education formula. But that also explains why some students are going to charter school with a $20,000 tuition going into the charter school's bank. And they obviously aren't getting any different of an education from the students who have that lower tuition.
I mean, based on your reporting, it sounds like sometimes they're getting a far worse education, right?
Yeah. Yeah, actually, the charter schools are performing pretty poorly. They are much lower graduation rates. They have much lower test rates, not just in how not just in the performance on tests, but also they're taking mandatory tests like the PSSAs at lower numbers, like fewer students are, I guess, agreeing to take them. And it's much harder to enforce things like that from a cyber school, obviously.
And I guess because we don't have as much transparency into them, they're not, I hate to say as accountable because that sounds judgmental, but they don't have to report every play-by-play the way that a regular public school does. And, you know, it's interesting because you're right. They do serve a different population in a way that's skewed differently than what you would see in the traditional public school. And so I think there's probably a legitimate conversation there about why, you know, $8,000 per student may be really difficult in some cases. But just the fact that the door is open to this conversation, I don't think we said it before, but this cyber charter tuition formula has been around since 2002, and the willingness to change it has not been there. A lot of this is wrapped up in the school choice conversation. Cyber charters are another form of school choice, and there's been small concessions on both sides, I think, about what school choice should look like. But I would say this is a pretty big concession from Republicans to admit, or not admit, I should say, but to support lowering the rate. And I think you're right that Auditor General report had a lot to do with it. What else was in that report besides the fact that, you know, schools were performing poorly?
A big thing was how much they're keeping in their reserves. So they have much, much bigger reserves than a traditional public school has. And that's one of the ways that these cyber charters are kind of walking a line between a like private for-profit sort of company and a school that's part of the Pennsylvania public school system. So, you know, they're run by CEOs, not principals. And they advertise, which obviously regular public schools do not. So they have this interesting blend between the two where they've been able to accumulate a lot of money and resources that normal schools wouldn't. In fact, some of the schools have a lot of property, which you would think isn't very necessary for cyber schools. Obviously, there needs to be somewhere for staff to go, but amassing, you know, several buildings of property across the state seems like more of a real estate investment than it is a function of being a school. So there are things like that I think that the auditor would like to see crack down on to really define their function as a school. And I think if that can be defined, you know, they could play a very important role in Pennsylvania's public school systems. I mean, I know I didn't really love my high school, and if I had an alternative like cyber school, I probably would have loved to go to it if it was performing well. I mean, if they were really teaching people well and getting good results. And I know a lot of parents who feel that way. I think on both sides of the aisle, they're not everyone's going to fit into the traditional public school model. So I think that there is an openness towards school choice. There's just concern about where state money gets spent, because this state first and foremost has to fulfill that obligation that it has constitutionally to provide a good public school system. So if those cyber charters are going to be part of this public school system, they do have to step up in terms of how they perform.
All right, Christina, thanks for joining us today. If you want to keep up with this story, go to thecentersquare.com.